Hello and welcome back to the channel. I hope you've all had a great weekend. And if you are new here, my name is Michael, and this is where we read through powerful books. We do some reflection. We read them slowly, intentionally, and extract principles that build character, strengthen discipline, and elevate the way we think. On this channel, we don't just read for information, we read for formation. Before information can be heard once, uh, because information can be heard once and be forgotten, but formation reshapes our identity. Today, we continue through our journey through Bushido, The Soul of Japan by Inazo Nitobe. I'll show you just a quick look at it, right? And we arrive at chapter 14, titled The Training and Position of Woman. I would have thought it said women, but it says woman on here. This chapter is one I've decided to do in two parts, and I'll explain why. But first, let's briefly reflect on chapter 13, where in chapter 13, Nitobe explored loyalty, not as blind obedience, but as a deeply rooted moral commitment. Loyalty in the Bushido framework was not transactional, it was not convenience based, it was covenantal. They made a covenant to themselves. A samurai's devotion to his lord was an extension of his inner honor. It was alignment between values and action. What stood out to me was that loyalty wasn't weakness, it was strength under voluntary discipline. It required ego to be subordinated into something greater. And if we think about that in modern terms, loyalty today might look like consistency. It might look like showing up for your family, your craft, your community, work, especially when it's inconvenient. Loyalty is staying committed to the gym when motivation dips. It's staying committed to your spouse when emotions fluctuate. It's staying committed to your business when sales are low. And if you follow me on LinkedIn or here on YouTube, you'll know that I believe real growth happens when we take full responsibility for our lives without exception and without condition. That principle and loyalty are they are deeply connected. Now, chapter 14 shifts the lens. This chapter addresses the training and social position of women within the Bushido system. It is thoughtful, it is culturally rooted, and it requires careful reading. I've chosen to divide this into two parts because this chapter deserves space, not speed. When something touches family, education, character formation, and gender roles, it deserves reflection rather than reaction. So, too often we consume complex topics in one sitting and move on without digestion. But digestion is where understanding lives. So, today we will read up to the line, if you've got a copy of it. The gratitude we owe him is as deep as the sea and as high as the hills. And in the next episode, we will continue and unpack the remainder. You know, sometimes slowing down is not delay, it is discipline. So before we begin reading, if you're um, finding value in these breakdowns, I'd really appreciate your support. Please like the video, share it with someone who values growth, subscribe to the channel, and turn on all notifications so that you don't miss the second part of this chapter, or you can always go back and go through the chapters. I mean, we are at chapter 14 and we started at chapter 1. So there's a wealth of knowledge in my previous videos. Your engagement as well helps this content reach others who may never pick up a book themselves. And with that, I thank you. But let's begin with the reading. The training and position of woman. The female half of our species has sometimes been called the paragon of paradoxes because the intuitive working of its mind is beyond the comprehension of men's arithmetical understanding. The Chinese ideogram denoting the mysterious, the unknowable, consists of two parts, one meaning young and the other woman, because the physical charms and delicate thoughts of the fair sex are above the coarse mental caliber of our sex to explain. In Bushido, ideal of woman, however, there is little mystery and only a seeming paradox. I have said that it was Amazonian, but it is only half the truth. Ideographically, the Chinese represent wife by a woman holding a broom, certainly not to brandish it offensively or defensively against her conjugal ally, neither for witchcraft, but for the more harmless uses for which the besom was first invented. The idea involved being thus not less homely than the etymological derivation of the English wife and daughter. Without confining the sphere of woman's activity to Kuche, Kirche, Kinder, as the present German Kaiser is said to do, the Bushido ideal of womanhood was preeminently domestic. These seeming contradictions, domesticity and Amazonian traits, are not inconsistent with the precepts of knighthood, as we shall see. Bushido, being a teaching primarily intended for the masculine sex, the virtues it prized in woman were naturally far from being distinctly feminine. Winckelmann remarks that the supreme beauty of Greek art is rather male than female, and Lecky adds that it was true in the moral conception of the Greeks as in their art. Bushido similarly praised those women most who emancipated themselves from the frailty of their sex and displayed an heroic fortitude worthy of the strongest and the bravest of men. Young girls, therefore, were trained to repress their feelings, to indurate their nerves, to manipulate weapons, especially the long-handled sword called naginata, so as to be able to hold their own against unexpected odds. Yet the primary motive for exercises of this martial character was not for use in the field. It was twofold, personal and domestic. Woman, owning no suzerain of her own, formed her own bodyguard. With her weapon, she guarded her personal sanctity with as much zeal as her husband did his master's. The domestic utility of her warlike training was in the education of her sons, as we shall see later. Fencing and similar exercises, if rarely of practical use, were a wholesome counterbalance to the otherwise sedentary habits of woman. But these exercises were not followed only for hygienic purposes. They could be turned into use in times of need. Girls, when they reached womanhood, were presented with dirks, which might be directed to the bosom of their assailants, or, if advisable, to their own. The latter was very often the case, and yet I will not judge them severely. Even the Christian conscience, with its honor of self immolation, will not be harsh with them, being Pelagia and Domnina, two suicides, were canonized for their purity and piety. When a Japanese Virginia saw her chastity menaced, she did not wait for her father's dagger. Her own weapon lay always in her bosom. It was a disgrace to her not to know the proper way in which she had to per- perpetrate self destruction. For example, little as she was taught in anatomy, she must know the exact spot to cut in her throat. She must know how to tie her lower limbs together with a belt so that, whatever the agonies of death might be, her corpse be found in utmost modesty, with the limbs properly composed. Is not a caution like this worthy of the Christian Perpetua or the Vestal Cornelia? I would not put such an abrupt interrogation were it not for a misconception, based on our bathing customs and other trifles, that chastity is unknown among us. On the contrary, chastity was a preeminent virtue of the samurai woman, held above life itself. A young woman, taken prisoner, seeing herself in danger of violence at the hands of the rough soldiery, says she will obey their pleasure, provided she be first allowed to write a line to her sisters, whom war has dispersed in every direction. When the epistles when the epistle is finished, off she runs to the nearest well and saves her honor by drowning. The letter she leaves behind ends with these verses: For fear lest clouds may dim her light, should she graze this nether sphere, the young moon poised above the height doth hastily betake to flight. It would be unfair to give my readers an idea that masculinity alone was our highest ideal for women. Far from it. Accomplishments and the gentler graces of life were required of them. Music, dancing, and literature were not neglected. Some of the finest verses in our literature were expressions of feminine sentiments. In fact, women played an important role in the history of Japanese belles lettres. Dancing was taught, I'm speaking of samurai girls and not of geisha, only to smooth an angularity of their movements. Music was to regale the weary hours of their fathers and husbands. Hence, it was not for the technique, the art as such, that music was learned, for the ultimate object was purification of heart, since it was said that no harmony of sound is attainable without the player's heart being in harmony with herself. Here again we see the same idea prevailing which we notice in the training of youths, that accomplishments were ever kept subservient to moral worth. Just enough of music and dancing to add grace and brightness to life, but never to foster vanity and extravagance. I sympathize with the Persian prince who, when taken into a ballroom in London and asked to take part in the merriment, bluntly remarked that in his country they provided a particular set of girls to do that kind of business for them. The accomplishments of our women were not acquired for show or social ascendancy. They were a home diversion, and if they shone in social parties, it was as the attributes of a hostess. In other words, as a part of the household contrivance for hospitality. Domesticity guided their education. It may be said that the accomplishments of the women of old Japan, be they martial or pacific in character, were mainly intended for the home, and however far they might roam, they never lost sight of the hearth as the center. It was to maintain its honor and integrity that they slaved, drudged, and gave up their lives. Night and day, in tones at once firm and tender, brave and plaintive, they sang to their little nests. As daughter, woman sacrificed herself for her father, as wife for her husband, and as mother for her son. Thus, from earliest youth, she was taught to deny herself. Her life was not one of independence, but of dependent service. Men's helpmeet, if her presence is helpful, she stays on the stage with him. If it hinders his work, she retires behind the curtain. Not infrequently does it happen that a youth becomes enamored of a maiden who returns his love with equal ardor. But when she realizes his interest in her, makes him forgetful of his duties, disfigures her person that her attractions may seize. Azuma, the ideal wife of the ideal wife in the minds of the samurai girls, finds herself loved by a man who, in order to win her affection, conspires against her husband. Upon pretense of joining in the guilty plot, she manages in the dark to take her husband's place, and the sword of the lover assassin descends upon her own devoted head. The following epistle, written by the wife of a young daimyo before taking her own life, needs no comment. Oft have I heard that no accident or chance ever mars the march of events here below, and that all moves in accordance with a plan. To take shelter under a common bough or drink from the same river is alike ordained from ages prior to our birth. Since we were joined in ties of eternal wedlock, now 2 short years ago, my heart hath followed thee, even as its shadow followeth an object, inseparably bound heart to heart, loving and being loved, learning but recently, however, that the coming battle is to be the last of thy labor and life. Take the farewell greeting of thy loving partner. I have heard that Kou, the mighty warrior of ancient China, lost the battle, loth to part with his favorite Gu. Yoshinaka, too, brave as he was, brought disaster to his cause, too weak to bid prompt farewell to his wife. Why should I, to whom earth no longer offers hope or joy, why should I detain thee or thy thoughts by living? Why should I not rather await thee on the road which all mortal kind must sometime tread? Never prithee, never forget never forget the many benefits which our good master Hideyori hath heaped upon thee. The gratitude we owe him is as deep as the sea and as high as the hills. Right. What becomes clear in this first half of the chapter is that education in the Bushido tradition was never about comfort or status. It was about preparation for responsibility. The women described here were formed with intention. Their development centered on composure, moral clarity, resilience, loyalty, and quiet strength. There was an expectation that character would be cultivated long before authority or influence was ever exercised. That principle transcends time. And in our modern world, we often pursue outcomes before we have built the inner framework required to sustain them. We desire financial success without mastering stewardship, influence without developing integrity, recognition without earning competence. Yet history consistently demonstrates that external elevation without internal structure leads to instability. Consider wealth as an example. Money in itself does not create security, disciplined thinking does. The ability to allocate resources wisely, delay gratification, assess risk, and remain composed under pressure determines whether prosperity compounds or collapses. Financial growth begins long before income increases. It begins with organized habits and intentional decision making. The same dynamic applies to relationships. Strong partnerships are not formed through convenience but through consistency, patience, and contribution. When a person approaches connection with a mindset of service rather than self interest, trust naturally deepens. Trust, once established, becomes the foundation upon which lasting bonds are built. Um, Stability in relationships is really accidental. It is the product of thoughtful behavior repeated over time. There's also an important lesson here about awareness. Personal development is not automatic. Without reflection, we default to impulses. Conscious thought interrupts that cycle when we become attentive to our reactions, priorities, and patterns. We gain the ability to shape them deliberately. That awareness transforms drifting into direction. From that direction flows progress. Physical well being improves, and daily choices align with long term health. Emotional steadiness strengthens when perspective is governed by gratitude rather than comparison. Professional success expands when time is structured carefully and energy is invested where it creates genuine value. Efficiency, in this sense, is not about busyness. It's about clarity. When time is organized intentionally, space is created for meaningful work, deeper relationships, and thoughtful rest. This structure it reduces avoidance problems because decisions are no longer reactive but measured. A life arranged with purpose naturally produces steadiness. Ultimately, preparation determines your position. Before any visible achievement appears, there must be invisible refinement. The discipline practiced in private shapes the opportunities sustained in public. So when we commit to becoming reliable, thoughtful, and value-driven individuals, goals move from aspiration to inevitability. As we move into the second part of this chapter, it may be worth asking yourselves, what are we preparing for through our daily habits? What are our routines? Our routines building resilience, clarity, and capacity, or are they reinforcing distraction? Growth is rarely dramatic and is constructed quietly, choice by choice, hour by hour. Yet over time, those choices shape not only our success, but our sense of fulfillment, our stability, and the quality of the relationships we build. That is the deeper invitation here. So, not simply to observe history, but to examine our own formation. And as always, thank you for joining me on here. Thank you for your time. And as always, keep reading, keep reflecting, and keep becoming the best version of you that you could possibly be. And I hope to catch you on the next live. It's all scheduled. Um, so we'll be looking forward to seeing you on part two. Thank you for joining me here on Michael Reed's Tada. Take care.